They call him Stumbling Sam, that worthless drunk who can barely stay on his horse and spends his days mumbling into whiskey bottles at the Crooked Nail Saloon. The Blackwater Gang mocks his trembling hands and slurred speech, treating him like another washed-up rancher, drowning his failures in cheap bourbon. What they don't know is that those shaking hands once earned him the name Shadow McCullough, the deadliest gunslinger west of the Mississippi. What they don't realize is that every stumble hides 15 years of tracking outlaws through the territory's deadliest terrain. And what they'll soon learn is that this grieving widower isn't here to raise cattle. He's here to hunt down the murderers who killed his wife and burned his ranch to ashes. They really should have asked around about those mysterious hangings down in Texas, because Samuel McCullough didn't quit killing. He's just gotten more selective about his targets. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the muddy main street as Sam McCullough slouched against the saloon's weathered post, his threadbare coat stained with spilled whiskey. To anyone watching, he was just another broken man trying to drink away his memories. The Blackwater boys had made a game of it lately, betting on how long he could stay upright, knocking the bottle from his hands just to watch him crawl after it. But beneath his unfocused gaze, Sam counted weapons, noted positions, mapped every detail with the precision that had once made him the territory's most feared lawman. "Hey there, Stumbling Sam!" Billy "Quick Draw" McGill called out, the youngest of the Blackwater crew, strutting across the street with his new pearl-handled revolver, prominently displayed. "Ain't it time for your afternoon tumble in the horse trough?" Sam's hands shook as he lifted the bottle to his lips, but beneath the brim of his battered hat, his eyes tracked every movement with predatory focus. 3 more Blackwater riders were positioning themselves along the street, same as they had back at his ranch 6 months ago, when the night exploded in gunfire and flame. His fingers twitched, muscle memory recalling the weight of his custom Colt Peacemaker, now hidden beneath floorboards at his rented room above the general store. "Leave him be, Billy," Martha Chen called from her laundry shop's doorway, her voice carrying an edge of concern. The Chinese woman had shown him kindness these past months, never questioning why a supposed drunk's clothes always smelled of gun oil beneath the whiskey. Man's got enough troubles, but Billy was showing off for his crew now, swagger-fueled by youth and cruelty. He kicked the bottle from Sam's grasp, sending it shattering against the post. "Oops," he sneered. "Butterfingers. Just like your wife that night she dropped her gun, ain't that right? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Sam's hands steadied for just a fraction of a second, a tell that none of them caught. 6 months he'd played this role, building his cover one stumble at a time. 6 months tracking shipments, following whispered rumors about the Blackwater Gang's real business, running guns to renegade tribes, selling stolen army rifles to the highest bidder. 6 months waiting for their guard to drop, for them to see exactly what they wanted to see. Another broken man, no threat to anyone. The sound of approaching hooves drew Sam's bleary gaze up the street. 3 army supply wagons rolled into town, heavily guarded, too heavily guarded for simple provisions. He noted faces, positions, weapons. The Blackwater Gang was expanding their operation, getting bolder. Soon they'd have enough firepower to arm half the territory. Sheriff Tom Hayes watched from his office doorway, deliberately looking anywhere but at the confrontation unfolding. Sam had learned early on that the law in Rattlesnake Creek was as crooked as the saloon's nail. The sheriff's pockets jingled with Blackwater silver, buying his silence and cooperation. It was a familiar song. Sam had heard it too many times during his years as a marshal, before he'd hung up his badge to marry Sarah and try for a quieter life. Sarah. Even now, the memory of her smile could pierce through his carefully constructed haze. She'd been the one to convince him to leave the killing behind, to build something permanent. They'd chosen this valley for their ranch, drawn by its pristine streams and rich grazing land. For 3 years they'd lived their dream, raising horses and planning for a family. Then the Blackwater Gang had arrived, demanding protection money, claiming the valley as their territory. When Sam and Sarah refused, they'd made an example of them. Billy kicked dust in Sam's face, laughing as the older man coughed. "What's wrong, old-timer? Thirsty? Maybe if you beg real nice-like, I'll buy you another bottle. Get down on your knees and bark like the dog you are." Young Tommy Chen, Martha's son, started forward from the laundry shop, his teenage face flushed with anger. Sam caught the boy's eye, giving an imperceptible shake of his head. Not yet. The kid had fire, reminded Sam of himself at that age. Over the months, he'd noticed Tommy watching the Blackwater Gang with the same quiet intensity that had once earned Sam his nickname. The boy had potential, but he needed to learn patience first. "I said bark." Billy's boot connected with Sam's. Ribs, not hard enough to do real damage, but enough to make him curl up protectively. The gathered crowd murmured uneasily but did nothing. Fear had hollowed out this town, turned good people into cowards. Sam knew the feeling. He'd seen it too many times in too many places. But he also knew that fear could be broken if someone were willing to stand up first. Sam's trembling hands pushed against the muddy street as he struggled to rise. Every movement was calculated, every shake and stumble, part of a performance 6 months in the making. Because what Billy and his boys didn't know, what none of them had figured out, was that Stumbling Sam's legendary drinking problem was mostly an act. Those bottles he clutched were filled with colored water, his slurred speech practiced in front of a mirror, his stumbling steps choreographed like a deadly dance. "Please," Sam slurred, swaying as he stood. "Just need a drink to steady." "My nerves." Billy leaned in close, his breath reeking of tobacco. "I said bark, old man." Instead, Sam whispered 3 words, so soft only Billy could hear them. "Remember the shadow." The color drained from Billy's face as recognition dawned. Too late. Because Samuel McCullough hadn't spent the last 6 months drinking himself to death. He'd spent them planning exactly how to dismantle the Blackwater Gang, one terrified piece at a time. He'd spent them watching their patterns, learning their weaknesses, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And now, with those army wagons, full of stolen weapons rolling into town, that moment had finally arrived. The war for Rattlesnake Creek was about to begin, and Stumbling Sam had just taken his last fall. Tomorrow, they'd learn why his old friends in the Marshal Service used to say that Shadow McCullough didn't just hunt men, he haunted them first, turning their own fears into weapons sharper than any bullet. Billy stumbled back, hand instinctively, moving to his fancy pearl-handled revolver. But Sam knew the young gunslinger's tell, a slight twist of his left boot before drawing. It was amazing what you could learn about a man when he thought you were nothing but a drunk in the dirt. The stage was set. The pieces were in place. And Samuel McCullough's hands weren't shaking anymore. The dead quiet of a Texas evening settled over the dusty street as Billy McGill's hand hovered above his pearl-handled revolver. 6 months ago, that same unsettling silence had fallen over Sam's ranch just before all hell broke loose. The memory hit him with brutal clarity, as sharp as the smell of gunsmoke and burning wood that still haunted his dreams. Sarah had been brushing down their prize stallion, Shadow Dancer, when the first riders appeared. Sam remembered every detail of that moment. The way the setting sun caught her dark hair, how she'd laughed at something he'd said, the peaceful routine of their hard-earned life. Then hoofbeats had shattered the quiet and everything changed. "Got some mighty fine horses here," the lead rider had said, his black duster catching the dying light. Marcus Blackwater himself, though Sam hadn't known the name then. Shame if anything were to happen to them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Sarah's hand had tightened on the brush, but her voice remained steady. "This is private property. You're not welcome here." Sam had been cleaning tack in the barn, his gun belt hanging on a post, a mistake he'd never make again. He'd grown soft in those 3 years, let his guard down, believing he could leave his past behind. The Shadow's instincts had whispered warnings about strangers in town, about mysterious fires at farms that wouldn't pay protection, but he'd ignored them, wanting to believe in the quiet life he'd built. "Now that ain't neighborly," Blackwater had drawled, 5 more riders spreading out behind him, among them a younger Billy McGill still earning his place in the gang. "Way I see it, everyone in this valley needs insurance. Times being what they are, accidents happen." "We don't want any trouble," Sam had said, moving slowly toward the barn door, trying to position himself between the riders and his wife. But Sarah, fierce as always, stepped forward instead. "What we don't want," she'd declared, "is a bunch of two-bit thugs thinking they can shake down honest folk. My husband and I built this ranch from nothing. We're not giving you a penny." Sam had seen the shift in Blackwater's posture, the subtle tell of a man about to draw. Sarah had seen it too. She hadn't just married a former marshal, she'd learned. From him, her hand moved toward the rifle mounted above the stable door. "Your wife's got spirit," Blackwater had remarked, his voice carrying that special kind of cruelty that only true predators possess. "Might want to teach her some manners before she gets hurt." What happened next played out in Sam's nightmares every time he closed his eyes. Sarah's fingers had brushed the rifle, but Blackwater was faster. The shot caught her in the shoulder, spinning her into the stable wall. Sam had lunged for his gun belt, but more riders appeared from behind the barn, cutting him off. "Shouldn't have been so quick to hang up that badge, Marshal," Blackwater had called out, enjoying the revelation. "Shadow McCullough, ain't it? Heard you were quite something back in the day, but look at you now. Soft, slow, domestic, they'd forced." Sam to watch as they set fire to the barn, the flames spreading quickly to the house. Sarah, despite her wound, had fought like a mountain lion, managing to drop 2 of Blackwater's men before a second bullet silenced her forever. The last thing Sam saw before a rifle butt crashed into his skull was his wife's body being engulfed by the flames. He'd woken 2 days later in the town doctor's house, everything he'd built reduced to ashes. The sheriff had written it off as a tragic accident, a lantern knocked over, spooking the horses. No witnesses came forward. No justice would be served through legal channels. That night, as Sam stared at his reflection in the doctor's water basin, he'd made a decision. The Shadow couldn't come back, not directly. The Blackwater Gang would be watching for any sign of the legendary marshal seeking revenge. No, he needed something different, something they'd never suspect. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. He'd started by letting himself go, growing out his beard, cultivating the tremors that came with his injuries until they looked like a drunk's shakes. He'd learned to slur his speech, to stumble convincingly, to become the kind of man people looked away from in embarrassment. Each morning, he'd practice in front of the mirror until Stumbling Sam became more real than the Shadow ever was. The transformation hadn't been easy. The first time the Blackwater boys had knocked him down in the street, every instinct had screamed to fight back, to show them exactly who they were dealing with. But Sam had swallowed his pride along with the dust, playing his part perfectly. He'd let them mock him, let them think they'd broken him completely. Meanwhile, he'd watched and learned. Every bottle dropped gave him an excuse to crawl closer to their conversations, catching whispers about shipment routes and secret deals. Every stumble let him bump into corrupt officials, picking their pockets for incriminating documents. Before they even realized he was there, he'd learned which army officers were on the take, which merchants were being forced to cooperate, which families were being threatened into silence. Most importantly, he'd discovered the true scope of Blackwater's operation. The gang wasn't just running a protection racket, they were building an empire. Those army wagons rolling into town carried more than just supplies. They were part of a sophisticated gun-running operation, stealing military weapons and selling them to anyone with gold, renegade tribes, Mexican bandits, even foreign agents looking to destabilize the territory. The doctor who'd saved Sam's life, old Jim Cooper, was the only one who knew the truth. He'd helped maintain the deception, providing medications that could mimic drunken behavior while keeping Sam's mind sharp. Together, they'd mapped out the gang's entire operation, identifying weak points and potential allies. Martha Chen's laundry shop had become an unofficial headquarters. While Sam played the drunk in the street, Martha's sharp eyes and quick wit gathered information from every corner of town. Her son Tommy, eager to fight back against the men who'd been terrorizing his community, had become Sam's secret student. The boy had a natural talent for observation and an athlete's instinct for movement. With the right training, he could become something special. Now, standing in the muddy street with Billy McGill's horrified recognition spreading across his face, Sam felt a familiar calm settle over him. The same clockwork clarity that had earned him his nickname, the ability to see every angle, every possibility, every weakness in his opponent's stance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You're dead, Billy whispered, his bravado cracking. Blackwater said, "The fire." "Fires can purify," Sam replied, his voice dropping its drunken slur, becoming the steel whisper that had once made hardened outlaws surrender rather than face him. "Or they can forge something stronger." The young gunslinger's hand trembled over his pearl-handled revolver. Behind him, his fellow gang members were slowly realizing something was wrong. The afternoon crowd began to disperse, sensing the violent storm about to break. "Those army wagons," Sam continued, straightening to his full height, shoulders squaring with the fluid grace of a predator uncoiling, "they wouldn't happen to be carrying the same weapons you used to murder my wife, would they?" Billy's face went pale, because now he understood they hadn't been tormenting some broken-down drunk for the past 6 months. They'd been playing with a ghost, a legend, a man who'd once tracked a killer through 3 territories using nothing but starlight and vengeance. The war for Rattlesnake Creek wasn't about to begin. It had started 6 months ago, the moment Sam McCullough decided to die so the shadow could live again. And now, as Billy stared into eyes that had never been clouded by drink, he realized exactly what kind of devil they'd been mocking all this time. Billy McGill's fingers twitched above, his pearl-handled revolver, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling evening air. The street had emptied in seconds, townspeople melting into doorways and behind wagons, leaving a stark arena for what was about to unfold. Sam noticed young Tommy Chen positioning himself behind his mother's laundry shop sign, hand slipping, beneath his apron, where Sam knew he kept a derringer, just like they'd practiced. "Stand down, boy," Sam said softly, his voice carrying that special kind of authority that came from years of facing down killers. "You've got 2 tells in your draw. That left boot twist and the way your eyes flick to your target before you move makes you predictable." The other Blackwater riders were frozen, caught between drawing their weapons and the growing realization of exactly who they'd been tormenting these past months. Sam tracked their positions without seeming to move his head, counting weapons, noting distances, calculating angles, just like he'd done countless times during his martial days. "You're lying," Billy managed, though his voice cracked. "The shadow's dead. Everyone knows that fire killed a good woman." Sam cut him off, steel entering his tone. "Burned down a good home. But fire's a funny thing, Billy. Sometimes it burns away everything but the truth. His hands, steady now, hung loose at his sides. Like the truth about those army wagons. The truth about what Marcus Blackwater's really building out here. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sheriff Hayes appeared in his office doorway, rifle in hand, but uncertainty on his face. The lawman's loyalty to Blackwater was bought and paid for, but he'd also heard the stories about the shadow. Every lawman had. Now see here, Hayes called out, trying to sound authoritative. I won't have any trouble in my town. Your town. Sam's laugh was cold as mountain water. 3 train robberies in the past month. 2 homesteads burned out. Army weapons disappearing between here and Fort Madison. And you, wearing that tin star while your pockets jingle with blood money. He finally turned his head to look at the sheriff. Tell me, Hayes, does Marcus let you know when he's selling rifles to the Ghost Tribe raiders, or does he just pay you extra when the bodies start piling up? The sheriff's face went red, then white, because Sam hadn't been just playing drunk. These past months, he'd been gathering evidence, piecing together the full scope of Blackwater's operation. The gang wasn't just running guns, they were arming both sides of every conflict in the territory, profiting from the chaos they created. One of the other riders, a scarred man Sam knew as Rattler Pete, finally found his voice. Boss said if the shadow ever showed his face— Your boss isn't here, Sam interrupted, but I'm betting he will be once word reaches him about those wagons being delayed. Military hardware's expensive, after all. The kind of merchandise that needs personal attention. The implications hit them all at once. Sam hadn't just been playing a role, he'd been laying a trap. The army wagons were bait, drawn here by carefully planted information, whispered in the right ears during his drunken stumbles through town. Billy's nerve finally broke. His hand dropped to his gun, but Sam had been right about those tells. Before the pearl-handled revolver cleared its holster, Sam's own weapon seemed to materialize in his hand, as if conjured from thin air. The shot cracked across the street, like summer lightning, precise and devastating. Billy screamed as the revolver went spinning from his grip, his trigger finger bleeding but intact. Sam had shot the gun itself, splitting the fancy pearl grip down the middle. A warning shot that proved everything they'd heard about the Shadow's deadly accuracy. That's one, Sam said calmly, his gun unwavering. I've got 5 more rounds, and there's 5 more of you. Or we can do this civilized, your choice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special. For you. Rattler Pete and the others exchanged glances, calculating odds that didn't add up in their favor. They'd heard stories about the Shadow's quick draw, about how he could put a bullet through a playing card at 50 paces. But it wasn't just the speed that had made him legendary. It was his patience, his ability to plan 3 moves ahead, to turn his opponent's strengths against them. Dr. Cooper, Sam called out, knowing the old physician would be watching from his office window. Might want to get your surgery ready. Though I promise if anyone else draws, they'll only need the Undertaker. The threat hung in the air like gun smoke, but Sam knew it wouldn't end here. These were just the foot soldiers, the visible part of Blackwater's operation. The real battle was still to come. Marshal, Sheriff Hayes tried again, using Sam's old title. Whatever you think you know, I know about the cave system out at Eagle's Ridge, Sam cut him off. Know about the hidden storage beneath the livery stable. Know exactly how many rifles you've helped disappear from army shipments. His eyes locked onto Hayes. Know which judge signed Sarah's death certificate without ever viewing the body. Hayes flinched as if struck, because now he understood. The drunk they'd all mockingly stepped around hadn't just been gathering information. He'd been building a case, documenting every crime, every crooked deal, every blood-soaked silver dollar that had passed through Blackwater's operation. The way I see it, Sam continued, his voice carrying to every shadowed doorway where townspeople listened, you've all got 2 choices. You can ride out now, Tell Marcus his operation in Rattlesnake Creek is finished, or you can try your luck against the ghost you thought you killed." Movement caught his eye. Tommy Chen shifting position, ready to support whatever came next. The boy had learned well these past months during secret training sessions, disguised as drunken stumbles behind the laundry. He wasn't the only one, either. Martha Chen's sharp eyes watched from her shop, where Sam knew she kept a shotgun loaded with salt shot. Old Jim Cooper had his medical bag ready, but also the army Colt he'd carried as a field surgeon during the war. They were all in position, all the pieces Sam had carefully maneuvered over 6 months of playing the broken-down drunk. Because he hadn't just been preparing for revenge, he'd been building an army of his own, right under Blackwater's nose. Rattler Pete was the first to back down, reining his horse around. The others followed, leaving Billy standing alone in the street, cradling his bleeding hand and staring at Sam with a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. "Tell Marcus," Sam said quietly, "that Shadow McCullough sends his regards. Tell him I'm coming for what's mine. And tell him—" he finally allowed a cold smile to cross his face— "that Sarah always said he had a tell in his drawer, too." The riders spurred their horses, kicking up dust as they fled toward Eagle's Ridge. Sam knew they'd reach Blackwater by nightfall, knew the gang leader would immediately begin mobilizing his forces. The real war was about to begin. Sheriff Hayes remained in his doorway, caught between duty and survival. "You've signed all our death warrants," he managed. "You don't know what Marcus is capable of." "No," Sam corrected him, finally holstering his weapon. "You don't know what I'm capable of, but you're about to learn." As if to punctuate his words, the evening stage arrived right on schedule. Sam allowed himself a grim smile as he watched the passengers disembark. Among them was a tall man in a dusty duster, carrying a distinctive rifle case, the first of Sam's old martial friends responding to the carefully coded messages he'd been sending out these past months. The war for Rattlesnake Creek wasn't just beginning. The pieces were already in play, the trap already sprung. And somewhere out at Eagle's Ridge, Marcus Blackwater was about to discover that some ghosts do more than just haunt. They come back with reinforcements. Night fell over Rattlesnake Creek like a burial shroud, bringing with it the kind of tension that made old-timers check their ammunition and bar their doors. Sam sat in Martha Chen's back room, his time-worn peacemaker disassembled on the table before him, as he cleaned each piece with practiced precision. The smell of gun oil mixed with the steam from Martha's copper kettle, where she brewed her special blend of Chinese tea. "Your hands don't shake at all now," she observed, setting a cup beside him. "Must be strange not having to pretend anymore." Sam's fingers moved over the weapon's parts with fluid grace. 6 months of acting drunk. Feels strange to stand straight. Again, he reassembled the peacemaker with smooth efficiency, though I reckon the real performance is just beginning. The man in the dusty duster, U.S. Marshal Jack Cooper, no relation to the doctor, studied a map spread across the table. Red marks indicated Blackwater's known operations. Black X's showed suspected weapons caches. "You've been busy, Sam. This is more than just a gun-running operation. This is an empire," Sam finished, "using the territory's own conflicts to profit from both sides, selling rifles to the Ghost Tribe raiders, then selling protection to the towns they attack, arming Mexican bandits while taking army contracts to guard the border." He checked the peacemaker's action. Sarah figured it out first. That's why they killed her. She was going to expose everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Young Tommy Chen appeared at the door, his usual energy contained into coiled readiness. Riders approaching from the east. 4 men moving slow. One's wearing a badge. Looks like Sheriff Mills from Cedar Creek. Sam nodded, unsurprised. Hayes had been busy sending telegrams all afternoon, calling in reinforcements from other Compromised lawman in Blackwater's pocket. Right on schedule. You sure about this plan? Marshal Cooper asked, studying his old friend's face. Taking on corrupt lawmen, that's different from hunting outlaws. Gets politically complicated. Nothing complicated about justice, Sam replied, though his voice carried the weight of experience. Hayes made his choice when he helped cover up Sarah's murder. Same as Mills and the others made their choices when they took Blackwater's silver. His hands moved to check his spare ammunition. Besides, if we're right about those army wagons, this goes way beyond local politics. Martha's sharp eyes caught something in his tone. What aren't you telling us? Those weapons they're running? Sam's voice dropped lower. They're not just army surplus. Some of them are new designs, prototypes that never made it to production, which means someone high up is involved, Cooper finished grimly. Someone with access to military contracts and experimental weapons. Sarah found letters, Sam continued, correspondence between Blackwater and someone in Washington. She didn't know who, but his hand tightened on the peacemaker. That's why they had to silence her quickly, why they couldn't risk letting her talk. Tommy returned from his lookout position. Mills and his men are headed for the sheriff's office. But there's something else. Supply wagon came in from the south, carrying dynamite for the mining company. Except the mine's been closed for months, Sam nodded. They're fortifying, preparing for war. He stood, checking his weapon. One final time to make our next move. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Dr. Cooper entered, through the back door, carrying his medical bag. 4 more riders came into my clinic today, all asking about rehabilitation for old injuries. Veterans, by their bearing. Friends of yours? Called in some favors, Sam acknowledged. Men who owed the shadow a debt, or who never forgot what. It means to wear a badge with honor. They'll filter in slowly, looking like drifters and broken-down soldiers. By the time Blackwater realizes we're building an army, Speaking of armies, Martha interrupted, my contacts in the Chinese quarter say there's unusual movement in the caves, supplies being stockpiled, weapons being moved. They're preparing for something big. Sam absorbed this information with the same tactical precision that had once made him legendary, each piece fitting into a larger puzzle, a pattern emerging from the chaos. Blackwater's not just preparing for us, he's getting ready to move his whole operation. Those army wagons were the last piece he needed. For what? Tommy asked, his young face serious in the lamplight. War's brewing down in Mexico, Cooper explained. Revolution coming. Whoever controls the weapons supply will control the outcome. Worth millions to the right investor, and worth killing for. Sam added softly, worth burning down ranches and murdering innocent women for. A knock at the front door of the laundry made them all tense. Martha moved smoothly to her shotgun, while Tommy took up his practiced position of cover. Sam nodded appreciatively. They'd learned well during their months of preparation. But it was just old Jim Cooper, the doctor, his face grave in the lamplight. Telegram came for Hayes, he reported. Blackwater's calling in everyone. Every corrupt badge, every hired gun, every man who owes him a favor. They'll be here by tomorrow night. Sam checked his timepiece, his father's old railroad watch, one of the few possessions he'd saved from the fire. Sooner than that, Blackwater knows he has to move fast now, before we can fully mobilize. He'll push his men hard, ride through the night. I expect they'll hit us just before dawn. How can you be sure? Tommy asked. Because that's what I do, Sam replied. Strike hard and fast. Overwhelm any resistance before it can organize. It's what made him successful in the war, and it's what built his criminal empire. The others looked at him sharply. Martha's eyes narrowed. You knew him before. Sam was silent for a long moment, remembering. We served together, back when he still wore a uniform with honor, before he decided there was more profit in chaos than peace. His voice carried old pain, old betrayal. He was there when I earned the name Shadow, learned all my tricks, my methods, which means he knows how you think, Cooper finished. Knows your strategies? Maybe, Sam allowed a cold smile. Or maybe he just thinks he does. The Shadow he knew died in that fire 6 months ago. What rose from those ashes? He checked his weapon one final time. Well, we're about to find out exactly what that is. Martha began passing out ammunition. Her movements precise and practiced, each caliber sorted, each person's needs anticipated. My father always said, best way to survive a storm is to be the storm. Sam nodded, recognizing the wisdom, because that's what was coming to Rattlesnake Creek, a storm of lead and vengeance, of justice and retribution. But storms could be guided, their power harnessed by those who understood their nature. Tommy, he called softly. The boy looked up, eager but controlled. Time to put your training to use. I need eyes on every approach to town. Your friends, the ones we've been teaching. Get them in position. Remember what I taught you about signal fires? The boy nodded, already moving with purposeful grace. Sam watched him go, remembering another young man who'd once learned to move like that, to see like that, before the badge, before the legend, before the name Shadow ever crossed anyone's lips. They're just kids, Martha said softly. So was I when I first learned to track men through darkness, Sam replied. Sometimes the best scouts are the ones nobody notices, just like sometimes the best weapon is the one your enemy thinks is harmless. The night deepened around them, full of whispered preparations and carefully positioned allies. Tomorrow would bring blood and gunsmoke, justice and vengeance. But tonight belonged to the Shadow, as he made ready to show Marcus Blackwater exactly what kind of force he'd created when he burned down the wrong man's life. The war for Rattlesnake Creek was about to become legend. The false dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of cold gray, but Sam McCullough had been awake for hours. From his position on the church bell tower, he watched Tommy's signal fires flicker in the distant hills, 3 short, 2 long, just as they'd practiced. Blackwater's men were coming, just as he'd predicted, trying to catch the town sleeping. Wouldn't be the first time he's used darkness as cover, Sam muttered to Marshal Cooper, who crouched beside him with his distinctive long-range rifle. Did the same thing in '68, during that business with the Comanche raiders. Difference is, Cooper adjusted his scope. Back then he was wearing a uniform and fighting for something bigger than profit. Bigger. Sam's hands moved over his peacemaker, checking it one final time. People change, Jack. War has a way of twisting men's souls. Some come back harder, some softer, and some, he paused, remembering, some come back hungry for things that no amount of honest work can satisfy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first riders appeared like shadows against the lightening sky, moving with the kind of precision that spoke of military training. Sam counted 30, maybe 40 men, more than they'd expected, but not enough to change the plan. Through his spyglass, he spotted Marcus Blackwater himself, the man's black duster making him look like a crow coming to feast on carrion. Your move first, Cooper whispered. Just like old times? Almost, Sam replied, his voice carrying that deadly calm that had once made him legend. Except this time, we're not trying to take them alive. The riders split into smaller groups, each taking predetermined positions around the town. Sam noted their formation with grim satisfaction. Exactly where he'd predicted they'd go, exactly where he'd placed his own pieces on this deadly chessboard. Sheriff Hayes and his corrupted deputies were already moving to join Blackwater's men, their badges glinting dully in the pre-dawn light. But what they didn't know, what none of them had figured out yet, was that Sam hadn't spent the last 6 months just playing drunk. He'd been learning every angle of Rattlesnake Creek, every shadow and sightline, every crumbling wall that could provide cover or catch a ricochet. "Marshal," Martha Chen's voice came soft but clear through the speaking tube they'd rigged to the laundry shop below. "Dr. Cooper says the dynamite wagon is in position, waiting on your signal." Sam allowed himself a cold smile. Because that was the thing about playing the town drunk. Nobody paid attention when you stumbled near their precious wagons. Nobody noticed when shaking hands adjusted the placement of volatile cargo. Nobody suspected that every drunken stumble had been carefully choreographed to position the pieces of this deadly game. The first shots came from the east, where Sheriff Mills and his Cedar Creek riders tried to rush the livery stable. They were met with a hail of lead from positions Sam had prepared days ago, manned by veterans who'd answered his call for justice. The clash of gunfire shattered the pre-dawn quiet, sending sleeping birds scattering from the rooftops. "They'll try to," Cooper started, "push through the Chinese quarter," Sam finished, "using the narrow alleys for cover. It's what I'd do." He raised his hand, ready to signal. Good thing Martha's family had some ideas about dealing with unwanted visitors. Right on cue, the sound of shattering pottery filled the alley below, followed by cursing as Blackwater's men discovered the carefully placed obstacles and tripwires. More shots rang out, but Sam's people held their positions, just as they'd practiced during those long nights of preparation. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Through his spyglass, Sam watched Marcus Blackwater direct his men with the same tactical precision that had once made him a respected cavalry officer. But there was something different in his former friend's bearing now, a ruthlessness that hadn't been there during their days enforcing the law together. "You see it too?" Cooper asked softly. "He's desperate," Sam confirmed. "These weapons, those shipments, they're more than just business. He's got someone breathing down his neck, someone big." A movement caught his eye. Billy McGill, his hands still bandaged from their earlier encounter, trying to sneak around behind the general store. But Tommy Chen was already there, hidden in the shadows, just as Sam had taught him. The boy's warning shot sent Billy scrambling for cover, showing that Sam's lessons about precision over power had taken root. "Your boy's got talent," Cooper observed. "He's got heart," Sam corrected. "Same as his mother, same as this whole town. Once you scratch beneath the surface of their fear." The gunfight intensified as more of Blackwater's men pushed into the town proper. But Sam's carefully positioned allies held their ground, using every advantage he'd spent months preparing. Veterans who owed him favors, townspeople he'd secretly trained, even the Chinese laborers who'd suffered under Blackwater's extortion. All of them fighting with the coordination that came from careful planning and a cause worth dying for. "There," Sam pointed as Marcus Blackwater himself moved toward the sheriff's office, likely heading for the weapons cache hidden beneath it. "Time to remind him why they used to whisper my name around campfires." Cooper raised his rifle, but Sam put a hand on his arm. "Not yet. Let him think he's got the upper hand. Let him think." The explosion cut him off as the dynamite wagon detonated, the blast carefully calculated to collapse the entrance to the sheriff's office basement. Sam allowed himself a grim smile, remembering all those drunken stumbles that had allowed him to place the charges just so. "Jesus, Sam," Cooper breathed, "you really did think of everything." "Had 6 months to plan it," Sam replied, his voice carrying old pain and older purpose. 6 months of watching them strut around this town like they owned it. 6 months of letting them think they'd broken me completely. His hands steady on his weapon, he stood to his full height. "Time they learned what the shadow does to men who mistake patience for weakness. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you." The battle for Rattlesnake Creek had devolved into a series of running gunfights, each one orchestrated by Sam's careful planning. Every alley held a surprise, every rooftop concealed a shooter, every shadow might hide a defender ready to extract revenge for months of tyranny. But then something changed. A new sound cut through the gunfire, the thunder of approaching hooves. From the north, Sam's spyglass revealed a sight that made even his steady hands tighten on his weapon. Riders approaching fast, their uniforms marking them as army cavalry, but their formation all wrong for legitimate soldiers. "More of his men," Cooper growled, "disguised as military." "No," Sam's voice carried a new edge of concern. "Those are real soldiers, but they're not riding for us." He focused the spyglass on their leader, noting the captain's bars and the familiar way the man sat his horse. "That's Robert Blackwater, Marcus's younger brother, the one who stayed in the army," Sam confirmed. "Who's been helping supply his brother with military hardware. Looks like Marcus called in his insurance policy." The revelation changed everything. Regular army meant regular army protocols, meant legitimate authority, even if it was corrupted. Authority meant the simple justice of a gunfight was about to become something far more complicated. "Sarah's letters," Sam said softly, almost to himself. "The ones that got her killed. They weren't just about Marcus's operation. They were about how high this really goes," Cooper swore softly. "Sam, if we're shooting at army uniforms, we're not just facing a gang anymore," Sam finished. "We're facing something bigger, something with roots in Washington itself." His mind raced through implications, through possibilities. That's why Marcus was so desperate to move those weapons. He's not just supplying local conflicts, he's arming something bigger, something coming. The approaching cavalry began to deploy, their movements showing the kind of precision that only came from real military training. But Sam noticed something else too, the way they positioned themselves, the specific formations they took. "They're not here to fight us," he realized suddenly. "They're here to secure those weapons, to make sure whatever's in those wagons doesn't fall into the wrong hands, or the right ones. Wrong hands being anyone who might expose what they're really doing," Cooper added grimly. Sam's mind raced back to Sarah's last days, to the pieces of information she'd been gathering. Not just about local gun running, but about something larger. Something that went all the way to the halls of power back east. "Change of plans," he said softly, checking his ammunition. "We're not just fighting for Rattlesnake Creek anymore. We're fighting for the truth Sarah died trying to expose." His eyes tracked the cavalry's movements, noting weaknesses, calculating odds. "And this time, we're going to make sure the whole territory knows exactly what kind of men wear those uniforms." The war for Rattlesnake Creek had just become something much bigger than revenge. It had become a fight for the soul of the frontier itself. Captain Robert Blackwater's cavalry unit spread through Rattlesnake Creek streets with military precision, their uniforms neat despite the hard ride. Sam watched from his position in the church tower as they established a perimeter, noting how their formations deliberately cut off potential escape routes. This wasn't just a show of force, it was a containment operation. "They're boxing us in," Cooper muttered, his rifle, tracking the soldiers' movements, using standard army tactics but with a twist. "See how they're positioning to protect the warehouse district, not the townspeople," Sam finished. His mind flashed back to battles long past, to other times he'd seen Robert Blackwater deploy men. He always did favor the hammer over the scalpel. Different from his brother that way. A flash of movement caught his eye. Marcus Blackwater himself, moving with purpose toward the army lines. Even at this distance, Sam could read the tension in his old friend's bearing. Something had the gang leader rattled. Something beyond just the exposure of his operation. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marshal, Martha's voice came through the speaking tube again. Sheriff Hayes is trying to rally men at the saloon. Says anyone who stands down now will be granted immunity. Army authority. Sam's laugh was cold as mountain steel. Immunity. That's what they offered Sarah, too, right before they burned our home. His hands moved over his weapon with deadly purpose. Time to change the game. Sam, Cooper's voice carried warning. You start shooting at army uniforms, there's no going back. Whole territory will be after us. Maybe that's exactly what we need. Sam's eyes tracked another movement, Tommy Chen slipping through the shadows with a message tied to his belt. The boy had learned well, moving in ways that even trained soldiers wouldn't notice. Sometimes the only way to lance a wound is to open it wide. Sarah's final words echoed in his memory. She'd tried to warn him that last morning, tried to tell him how deep the corruption really went. The weapons being stolen weren't just for border raiders or local conflicts. They were part of something bigger, something that reached all the way to Washington. The sound of hooves on wooden planks drew his attention back to the street. Robert Blackwater was moving his command group toward the center of town, his captain's bars glinting in the strengthening dawn light. Sam studied his old comrade's face through the spyglass, noting the strain around his eyes, the way his hand kept straying to his dispatch pouch. Something's got the good captain spooked, Cooper observed. Those aren't just weapons in those wagons, Sam said slowly, pieces clicking into place. Sarah found something else, something worth killing for, something worth bringing in regular army to cover up. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. A flurry of movement caught his attention. Marcus and Robert. Blackwater meeting in the shadow of the general store, their argument carried up to Sam's position by the morning air. Can't wait any longer, Marcus was saying, his usual calm cracking. If those manifests get out, they won't, Robert cut him off. The senator's men are already on their way. We just need to hold the town until... The senator? Cooper whispered. Jesus, Sam, how high does this go? But Sam was already moving, his mind racing ahead like it used to in the old days, when the Shadow's reputation was built on being 3 steps ahead of his prey. Because now he understood why Sarah's death had been so brutal, so public. It wasn't just about silencing her, it was about sending a message to anyone else who might start asking questions. Tommy, he called softly, knowing the boy would be in position to hear. Get word to Martha. Tell her it's time for the second. I'm part of the plan. Motion rippled through the town as his message was passed. Sam had spent 6 months playing the drunk, yes, but he'd spent those same months building a network of his own. Every laundry worker, every stable hand, every seemingly broken-down veteran nursing drinks in the saloon. All of them placed exactly where they needed to be for this moment. The first sign that something was wrong came from the Army's supply wagons. Wheels suddenly broke, almost simultaneously, as hidden saw cuts finally gave way. Horses spooked as burrs carefully placed. In their blankets began to bite, and in the confusion, documents began to disappear, pulled from saddlebags and dispatch pouches by quick hands that had learned their trade in the war. Smart, Cooper grinned. Using their own formations against them. They're so busy watching the obvious threats, they don't see the real danger, Sam finished. Because that had been Sarah's final lesson. Sometimes the most devastating weapons weren't guns or dynamite, but information. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Robert Blackwater's shout of rage cut through the morning air as he discovered his dispatch pouch had been emptied. The captain's disciplined facade cracked, showing the same cruel desperation Sam had seen in Marcus's eyes 6 months ago. "Shoot anyone trying to leave town," Robert ordered his men. "No one gets out until those documents are recovered." But Sam had planned for this too. Smoke began to rise from multiple points around town. Not the chaos of a real fire, but enough to divide the soldiers' attention. And in that confusion, more of his pieces moved into position. "You're not just fighting them," Cooper realized, watching the coordinated response. "You're destroying their credibility, making them show their true colors in front of witnesses." "A man in uniform is still just a man," Sam replied, remembering lessons learned the hard way. "Push him hard enough, he'll forget his training." Forget? Which side of the law he's supposed to be on? Right on cue, one of Robert's lieutenants ordered his men to open fire on a group of townspeople who were resisting evacuation. The soldiers hesitated. These weren't outlaws or raiders, but American citizens on American soil. "Hold your fire!" The order came from an unexpected source. Sheriff Hayes himself, his face pale but determined. "These are our own people." Hesitation was all Sam needed, because while Robert's men were focused on controlling the town, they'd forgotten about the real target. The weapons in those wagons weren't just cargo. They were evidence. Evidence that could bring down not just the Blackwater brothers, but everyone connected to their operation. "Martha," Sam called through the speaking tube, "tell Tommy it's time, just like we practiced." The boy's signal came moments later, 3 quick flashes from a borrowed mirror, indicating that the last pieces were in position. Sam allowed himself a grim smile, remembering all those nights spent training the kid in the art of misdirection. "You know," Cooper said quietly, 6 months ago, when you told me your plan to play town drunk, I thought grief had broken you." "Grief didn't break me," Sam replied, checking his weapon one final time. "It forged me into something new, something that could fight this kind of corruption on its own terms." His eyes tracked the Blackwater brothers as they argued in the street below. They thought killing Sarah would silence the truth. Instead, they just gave it a voice they couldn't ignore. The war for Rattlesnake Creek was about to enter its final phase. But Sam McCullough wasn't fighting for just revenge anymore. He was fighting to expose a cancer that reached from this dusty frontier town all the way to the halls of power. And this time, he wasn't going to stop until the whole truth was dragged into the light. "Ready?" Cooper asked, reading the shift in his old friend's posture. Sam's hands were steady as sunrise as he raised his weapon. "Time to remind them why they used to call me Shadow." The real battle for justice was about to begin. Chaos erupted in Rattlesnake Creek's streets as Sam's carefully orchestrated plan unfolded. The army soldiers, trained to fight enemies they could see, found themselves facing a different kind of battle entirely. Documents vital to their operation kept disappearing, equipment mysteriously malfunctioned, and every attempt to restore order seemed to make things worse. "Enough!" Robert Blackwater's voice cracked with fury as another wagon's wheel collapsed, spilling crates into the dusty street. "Burn it! Burn everything!" But even as soldiers moved to comply, Sam's network was already in motion. Martha Chen's laundry workers, who'd spent months memorizing which crates held the most damaging evidence, began a series of accidents with wash water that just happened to soak specific documents before they could be destroyed. "You taught them well," Cooper observed from their position in the church tower, "using the Blackwater's own prejudices against them. They don't even see the laundry workers as a threat." "People see what they expect to see," Sam replied, remembering his own months of playing the pathetic drunk. Just like they never noticed how many former soldiers drink at Chen's tea shop instead of the saloon. Amazing what men will talk about when they think no one's listening, Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun climbed higher, casting harsh light on the unfolding drama. Marcus Blackwater paced like a caged wolf, watching his carefully built empire beginning to crumble. His men, already rattled by the earlier fighting, were starting to show cracks in their discipline. "The senator's deadline is noon," Robert was saying, his voice carrying on the morning air. "If we don't have this contained by then—" "To hell with the senator!" Marcus exploded. "This is about survival now. Where's Hayes?" But the sheriff was nowhere to be seen. Sam allowed himself a grim smile, remembering the look in Hayes's eyes when he'd realized just how deep the corruption went. Some men, when pushed far enough, remembered the true weight of the badge they wore. Movement caught Sam's eye. Tommy Chen, slipping through the chaos with practiced ease. The boy had learned his lessons well, moving like a shadow between points of cover. In his hand was a familiar leather folio, Sarah's research, recovered from its hiding place in the stable. "Smart woman, you're Sarah," Cooper said softly, "having copies made, hiding them around town." "She knew the risks," Sam replied, his voice tight with old pain and pride. "Knew they'd come for her eventually. Made sure the truth would survive even if she didn't." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. A cloud of dust on the horizon heralded new arrivals. More army reinforcements, but these wore different insignia. The cavalry unit from Fort Laramie, commanded by Colonel James Sherman, a man Sam knew well from his martial days. "This complicates things," Cooper muttered, but Sam was already adjusting his plan. Because Sarah's research hadn't just exposed the Blackwaters' operation, it had identified their enemies too. And Colonel Sherman had been on that list, marked as one of the few officers who couldn't be bought. "Actually," Sam allowed himself, a cold smile, "this is exactly what we need." The colonel's arrival threw the Blackwater brothers into visible panic. Robert's men, already struggling to maintain order, now found themselves facing regular army units who hadn't been compromised by greed or corruption. "Marshal," Martha's voice came through the speaking tube, urgent but controlled. "Dr. Cooper says the documents are ready. And Sheriff Hayes, he's made his decision." Sam nodded, though she couldn't see him, because that had been the real purpose of this morning's chaos, not just to expose the corruption, but to force men to choose sides, to show them that they could still stand for something more than profit and power. "Sam," Cooper's voice carried warning, "Marcus is moving toward the stable, and he's got that look. The same look he'd had the night he'd burned Sam's ranch, the look of a man ready to destroy everything rather than face justice. But this time, Sam was ready for him. "Tell Tommy to start Phase 3, he instructed Martha, "and get word to Hayes. It's time." The sheriff's office erupted in sudden activity as Hayes and his remaining loyal deputies emerged, rifles raised. But they weren't aiming at Sam's people or the townspeople. Their weapons were trained on Robert's soldiers. "By order of the United States Marshal Service," Hayes's voice rang out, carrying the authority he'd forgotten he had. "All Army personnel are ordered to stand down pending investigation of criminal conspiracy." Robert Blackwater's laugh was ugly. "You've forgotten who you work for, Hayes?" "No," the sheriff replied, his badge catching the morning light. "I finally remembered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The street erupted in sudden violence as Robert ordered his men to open fire. But Hayes wasn't alone. Other lawmen who'd been bought by the Blackwaters were remembering their oaths, choosing this moment to redeem themselves. "Sam," Cooper called urgently, "Marcus is going for the stable. If he reaches those documents, but Sam was already moving, his steps sure and steady as he descended the church tower. No more stumbling, no more pretense. The shadow was back, moving with the fluid grace that had once made him legend. "Remember," he called to Cooper, "whatever happens, make sure Colonel Sherman gets Sarah's evidence. The whole story needs to come out." The stable loomed ahead, its wooden walls holding not just Sarah's research, but something else, something that had made even a U.S. senator risk everything to cover it up. Marcus Blackwater stood in the doorway, torch in hand, his face twisted. With desperate fury, "Should have stayed dead, Sam," he called out. "Should have just kept drinking yourself into oblivion like a good broken man." "Funny thing about broken men," Sam replied, his voice carrying that deadly calm that had once made. "Outlaws surrender rather than face him. Sometimes what breaks them just shows them what they're really made of." The two men faced each other across the street, former friends turned deadly enemies. Behind them, the battle for Rattlesnake Creek raged on, army against army, law against corruption, truth against power. "You really want to know what Sarah found?" Marcus's laugh was hollow. "What was worth killing her for? It's bigger than just guns, Sam. Bigger than you can imagine. The senator, the weapons, the territories. It's all part of something coming, something that's going to change everything." "Maybe," Sam agreed, his hands steady at his sides. "But first, you have to get past me." The war for Rattlesnake Creek had become something more than just revenge. It had become a battle for the soul of the frontier itself. And Sam McCullough, the man they'd once called Shadow, was ready to make sure the truth saw daylight no matter the cost. The final confrontation was about to begin. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the street as Sam McCullough faced his former friend. Marcus Blackwater's torch flickered in the growing light, its flames reflecting in eyes that had lost all trace of humanity. Behind them, the battle for Rattlesnake Creek raged on, but here, in this moment, time seemed to stand still. The street had cleared, townspeople and soldiers alike sensing that something momentous was about to unfold between these two men. Sam could hear Cooper's rifle being positioned in the church tower, could sense Tommy Chen's presence on the stable, a roof, but his focus remained entirely on Marcus. There was something different in his old friend's bearing now, a desperate energy that made him more dangerous than ever. "You want to know what's really in those documents?" Marcus's voice carried a strange eagerness, like a man desperate to finally share a terrible secret. Why a U.S. senator would risk everything to keep them hidden. It's not just about guns, Sam. It's about the future. The future? Sam's hands remained steady at his sides, but his mind raced through possibilities. Or just your profits. Marcus's laugh was hollow. Profit, this is about power, real power. The kind that shapes nations. The torch wavered in his grip. Those weapons we've been moving, they're prototypes, things the Army's official weapons contractors won't touch, things that could change the face of warfare itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sam's mind flashed to Sarah's final notes, to the strange technical drawings she'd discovered. Designs that had made her hands shake when she understood their implications. Weapons that could kill hundreds with a single shot. Machines that could turn the tide of any battle. But it was more than just the weapons. It was the plan behind them. The senators not just covering up corruption, Sam said slowly, pieces clicking into place. He's building a private army, creating his own power base out here where no one's watching too closely. An army? Marcus's smile was terrible to behold. Try an empire. While the government debates policy, we're arming both sides of every conflict from here to Mexico City, creating chaos, then selling order to the highest bidder, the Ghost Tribe. Raids. We armed them, the militias that fought them back. We armed them too, Every bloodshed, every tragic conflict, all of it orchestrated, all of it profitable. He began pacing, the torch dancing dangerously close to the stable's dry wood. And the best part, they'll thank us for it, beg us for protection from the very storms we create. The senator understands what you never did, Sam. Power isn't about having the most guns, it's about controlling who has them, when they get them, and what they do with them. The sound of gunfire grew closer as Robert's corrupt soldiers clashed. With Colonel Sherman's loyal troops, Sam could hear Tommy Chen coordinating with Martha's people, making sure the evidence reached the right hands. But here, in this moment, none of that mattered, because Sam finally understood what Sarah had died trying to expose. "She figured it all out," he said softly, remembering his wife's determination in those final days. Not just the weapons trafficking, but the whole plan, creating artificial conflicts to justify military intervention, using the frontier as a testing ground for something bigger. She was always too smart for her own good, Marcus agreed, a flash of genuine regret crossing his face. "Just like you were always too righteous. Some things need to stay in the shadows, Sam. Some truths are too dangerous for daylight." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The torch in Marcus's hand dipped closer to the stable's dry wooden walls. Inside, Sam knew, were not just Sarah's documents, but proof of something even darker, a conspiracy that reached from this dusty frontier town all the way to Washington's. Corridors of power. Evidence that could bring down not just the Blackwater brothers, but senators, generals, men who thought themselves untouchable. "You really think burning it all will change anything?" Sam's voice carried that deadly calm that had once made him legend. "The truth's already out there. Hayes, Sherman, the territorial governor, they'll all know by sundown." "Maybe," Marcus conceded, "but they'll never be able to prove it. Not without these documents, not without Sarah's research, and by the time they dig through the ashes..." His smile turned cruel. "Well, accidents happen in times of chaos. Tragic how the town drunk finally snapped, taking so many good people with him. The implications hit Sam like physical blows, because of course that would be their plan, pin everything on the broken man, the former marshal who'd lost his wife, and his mind. The perfect scapegoat, already established through months of public degradation. They'd probably been planning it since the day they killed Sarah, setting up their fall guy with meticulous care. "Only one problem with that plan," Sam said softly, watching Martha's people moving into position through the windows of surrounding buildings. "You're assuming I'm still playing by the old rules, still operating like the lawman who trusted in justice and proper procedure." Movement caught his eye. Tommy Chen in position on the stable roof, Martha's workers spread through the surrounding buildings, Hayes and his reformed deputies creating a perimeter. All the pieces he'd spent 6 months positioning, all coming together in this moment. Even the town drunk's stumbling path through the streets had been carefully choreographed, each seemingly random movement part of a larger design. "Your brothers surrounded," Sam continued, noting how Robert's men were being systematically cut off from each other. "Your men are deserting, and that senator you're so proud of working for? He'll burn you the second he realizes you've become a liability. Men like him, they don't leave loose ends." Marcus's face twisted with fury. "You think I won't do it? Burn it all down just like I burned your ranch? I wasn't lying about the power, Sam. This goes higher than you can imagine. The senator's just one piece of it. There are men back east who've spent years planning this, building toward something bigger than territory or profit." "Oh, I know you will," Sam's voice was steel. "That's why I wanted you here, wanted you to see everything you built crumbling around you, wanted you to make that choice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Because that's what it had all been leading to. This moment, this choice. Sam had spent 6 months playing the broken man, letting Marcus think he'd won completely. But every stumble, every humiliation, every moment of apparent weakness had been drawing his old friend deeper into a trap. The stable's empty. "Marcus," Sam said quietly, "has been since yesterday, those documents you're so desperate to destroy. They're already in Colonel Sherman's hands. The real ones, anyway." His smile was cold as mountain steel. Amazing what people will ignore when they think they're watching a drunk stumble around town. How they never notice the papers changing. The messages being passed, the network being built right under their noses. The torch trembled in Marcus's grip as the truth hit him. All this time, while he'd been watching Sam play the pathetic drunk, the real work had been happening in plain sight. Every document copied, every piece of evidence carefully preserved and distributed. The very people they'd dismissed as beneath notice, laundry workers, stable hands, the women and Chinese laborers they'd treated as invisible, had been dismantling their empire piece by piece. "You're lying," Marcus snarled, but doubt had crept into his voice. His eyes darted around, finally seeing the trap that had been laid so carefully. "Am I?" Sam's hand moved to his gun with fluid grace. 6 months of watching you strut around this town. 6 months of learning every move you'd make. 6 months of letting you think you'd broken me completely. His eyes hardened. "But you forgot something important, old friend. You forgot why they used to call me Shadow." The torch dropped from Marcus's hand as he went for his gun, but Sam had been ready for that too. The Shadow's legend hadn't been built on speed alone. It had been built on the ability to read men's souls, to know their choices before they made them. The shot cracked across the street like summer lightning, precise and devastating. Marcus's gun went spinning away, his hand bleeding but intact, just like Billy's had been that first day. A warning shot that proved everything they'd whispered about the Shadow's deadly accuracy. "That's for Sarah," Sam said softly. "The next one won't be so gentle." The war for Rattlesnake Creek was reaching its final moments. Behind them, Colonel Sherman's men were securing the town, Robert Blackwater's. Corrupt soldiers surrendering or fleeing. But here in this dusty street, 2 former friends faced each other across a gulf built of betrayal and blood. The real reckoning was about to begin. Blood dripped from Marcus Blackwater's wounded hand, each crimson drop striking the dusty street. Like the tick of a clock counting down to judgment. Around them, the sounds of battle were fading as Colonel Sherman's men secured the town. But here, in this moment, the air crackled with unfinished business. "You really think this changes anything?" Marcus's voice was raw with fury and something else, fear, maybe, for the first time since Sam had known him. "Kill me, and there are still men in Washington who'll make sure this never sees daylight. Men with enough power to bury the truth, along with anyone trying to expose it." "Maybe," Sam acknowledged, his gun unwavering. "But Sarah didn't die for the truth to stay buried, and I didn't spend 6 months playing town drunk just to let them win." Movement caught his eye. Robert Blackwater being led past in irons, his captain's uniform dirty and torn. The younger brother's face was a mask of rage and disbelief as Colonel Sherman's men escorted him toward the jail. Behind him came Sheriff Hayes carrying a strongbox Sam recognized from the bank vault. "The money transfers," Marcus breathed, recognizing it too. "All the payment records. Amazing what people will do for redemption," Sam said quietly. "Hayes has been copying those records for weeks. Every transaction, every bribe, every piece of silver that bought men's souls." "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." The morning sun climbed higher, casting stark shadows across the street as more of Marcus's empire crumbled. Army wagons were being unloaded, their hidden compartments revealing not just weapons, but documents, ledgers, everything Sarah had died trying to expose. Tommy Chen coordinated with Martha's people, ensuring every piece of evidence reached the right hands. You still don't understand what you're dealing with. Marcus's laugh held an edge of madness. Those weapons, the ones Sarah found the plans for, they're just the beginning. The Senators group, they're planning something bigger. A new kind of warfare, fought with machines that can kill hundreds with a single shot, Sam finished. Weapons that could change the balance of power across the whole frontier. Sarah figured that out too. Why do you think she made so many copies of everything? Marcus's face went pale. Copies! You really should have checked her background more carefully. Sam allowed himself a grim smile. Before she married me, Sarah worked as a clerk in the territorial governor's office. She knew the importance of keeping multiple records, of hiding information in plain sight. The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow, because now he understood. They hadn't just been fighting a grieving widower out for revenge. They'd been fighting a carefully laid plan, one that had started taking shape the moment Sarah realized what she'd discovered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Ghost Tribe raids, Sam continued, watching his old friend's face. The weapons disappearing from army shipments. The accidents at farms that wouldn't pay protection money. Sarah documented all of it. But she knew they'd come for her eventually. So she made sure the truth would survive. Where? Marcus's voice cracked. Where did she hide them? Everywhere. Sam's smile was cold as mountain steel. In ledgers that looked like shipping manifests. In letters to friends that contained coded messages. Even in the laundry receipts at Martha's shop. Chinese characters that looked decorative but actually told a story of corruption and murder. Movement in his peripheral vision. Cooper, taking up position with his rifle, making sure Marcus couldn't make a break for it. But Sam knew he wouldn't run. Not now. Not with everything he'd built turning to ashes around him. You want to know the real irony? Sam's voice carried across the morning air. If you'd just left us alone, left the ranch in peace, none of this would have happened. Sarah might have kept quiet about what she'd found. I might have stayed retired, but you had to make an example of us. It wasn't personal, Marcus said quietly, something like regret crossing his face. You were both just in the way. The Senator's plan required complete control of the territory. No witnesses, no loose ends. It became personal the moment you burned my wife alive. Sam's voice turned to steel. The moment you decided to turn me into the town drunk, something to mock and abuse. 6 months, Marcus. 6 months of watching you strut around this town, like you owned it. 6 months of letting you think you'd broken me completely. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. The street had gone quiet, everyone sensing that something momentous was about to unfold. Even Colonel Sherman's men had stopped their work, watching the two former friends face each other across the gulf of betrayal and blood. You could have just killed me, Marcus said suddenly. That first day when you came to town, why the act? Why let us humiliate you for 6 months? Because death was too easy. Sam replied, his voice carrying that deadly calm that had once made him legend. I wanted you to feel what Sarah felt. The helplessness, the fear. Wanted you to know what it's like to watch everything you built burn to ashes. Marcus's hand moved like lightning, pulling a hidden derringer from his boot. But Sam had been ready for that too, had been ready for everything since the moment he'd walked into Rattlesnake Creek 6 months ago. The Shadow's shot cracked across the street before Marcus could level his weapon. The derringer went spinning away, along with 2 of Marcus's fingers. His scream of pain echoed off the buildings as he fell to his knees, clutching his mangled hand. That was for the ranch, Sam said softly, his gun never wavering. For our home, For the life we built, just finish it, Marcus ground out through clenched teeth. You've won. The senator's plan is exposed. The weapons will never reach their destination. Just end it. But Sam shook his head slowly. Death's too easy, old friend. I want you to live. Want you to spend every day in a territorial prison cell, knowing that everything you built, everything you killed for, is being dismantled piece by piece. Colonel Sherman approached, his cavalry uniform immaculate despite the morning's chaos. We've found the prototype weapons, he reported, along with documents linking them to 3 senators and a cabinet member. This goes higher than we thought. It always did, Sam replied, finally lowering his weapon. Sarah knew that. Knew we'd need more than just local law enforcement to bring it down. That's why she left a trail even a drunk could follow. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun climbed higher over Rattlesnake Creek as Sherman's men led Marcus away. The former gang leader's empire had crumbled in a single morning, brought down by the very man he'd thought he'd destroyed. Tommy Chen appeared at Sam's side, his young face serious. Dr. Cooper says we found all the documents. Everything Sarah hid, everything you gathered these past 6 months. It's over. But Sam knew it wasn't over. The truth about the weapons, about the senator's plans, about the corruption that reached from this dusty frontier town all the way to Washington, that truth would shake the territories to their foundations. And somewhere in the capital, powerful men were about to learn that their perfect plan had been undone by a woman clever enough to hide the truth, and a man patient enough to spend 6 months playing drunk while he gathered the pieces. The war for Rattlesnake Creek was ending, but the real battle was just beginning, and Sam McCullough, the man they'd once called Shadow, was ready for whatever came next, because some ghosts don't rest until justice is done. 3 months after the battle of Rattlesnake Creek, Sam McCullough stood at Sarah's grave, his hands steady as he placed fresh wildflowers beside the headstone. The autumn wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and somewhere in the hills a lone wolf called to its pack. You should have seen it, Sarah, he said softly. The senator's trial starts next week. 3 more congressmen implicated. The weapons program exposed. He touched the silver ring he still wore, remembering, you were right about everything. Right about how deep it went. Right about what needed to be done. The sound of approaching hooves drew his attention. Tommy Chen rode up on a paint horse that had once belonged to the Blackwater Gang, his badge, Deputy Marshal of the reformed Rattlesnake Creek law, catching the morning light. Marshal, the boy called out respectfully. Territorial governor's man is in town. Says there's more arrests coming in Washington. Sam nodded, unsurprised. Sarah's carefully hidden documents had proven to be just the beginning. Like pulling a loose thread, the whole tapestry of corruption had begun unraveling once they started tugging. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. How's Marcus enjoying territorial prison? Sam asked, though he already knew the answer. Tommy's grin was fierce, still claiming he's got friends in high places who'll get him out. But those friends seem mighty busy lately, what with all the federal investigations. The transformation of Rattlesnake Creek had been remarkable. With the Blackwater Gang's corruption exposed, legitimate businesses had begun returning. The Chinese quarter, no longer forced to pay protection money, was thriving. Even the old shooting academy had found new purpose. Martha Chen had turned it into a school where young deputies learned not just marksmanship, but the importance of justice over power. Got word from Colonel Sherman, too, Tommy continued. They found more of those prototype weapons cached up near Fort Laramie, some kind of new repeating rifle that could fire 40 rounds without reloading. The kind of weapon that could change the balance of power across the whole frontier, Sam. mused. Just like Sarah warned about, the investigation had revealed the full scope of the senator's plan. The weapons hadn't just been about profit, they'd been about control. By arming both sides of every conflict while maintaining official deniability, they'd hoped to create a shadow empire, one that could influence policy through carefully orchestrated chaos. "Sheriff Hayes sends his regards," Tommy added. "Says the new territorial marshal is working out well. Lot less corruption since they started paying closer attention to weapons shipments." Sam allowed himself a small smile. Hayes's redemption had been unexpected, but welcome. The former sheriff had turned state's evidence, his testimony helping to unravel the web of corruption that had stretched from Rattlesnake Creek to Washington itself. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." "And Robert Blackwater?" Sam asked, though he'd heard the news already. "Hung himself in his cell last week." Tommy's voice was grim. "Left a confession that implicated 3 more senators and a general. Martha's people are still translating some of the documents he mentioned. Looks like the weapon sales went further than just the Mexican border." Sam nodded, remembering the night Sarah had first discovered the foreign connections. She'd known then that she was onto something bigger than just local corruption. Known that the truth might cost her everything. "Town council's meeting today," Tommy continued after a respectful pause. "They're voting on renaming the main street. Want to call it Sarah's Way." Something caught in Sam's throat. Because that's what it had all been about, really. Not just revenge, not just justice, but making sure Sarah's sacrifice meant something. Making sure the truth she'd died protecting finally saw daylight. The sound of more horses approaching drew their attention. Marshal Cooper led a small group of riders, including Martha Chen and Dr. Cooper. They'd been out to the old Blackwater hideout at Eagle's Ridge, searching for more evidence. "Found something you need to see," Cooper called out, his face serious. He dismounted, pulling a leather folio from his saddlebag. "Hidden compartment in Marcus's office. Looks like Sarah wasn't the only one keeping records." Sam opened the folio, his trained eyes scanning the documents within. Letters, telegrams, coded messages, all pointing to something even bigger than they'd suspected. The weapons program hadn't just been about controlling the frontier. It had been a test run for something larger, something international. "There's more coming, isn't there?" Tommy asked quietly. "There's always more," Sam replied, remembering lessons learned the hard way. "Men like the senator, they don't work alone. There are others out there, other operations like this, other people willing to profit from chaos." Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Martha Chen approached, her sharp eyes noting Sam's expression. "You're not staying, are you?" "No," Sam admitted. "These documents, what they reveal, someone needs to follow the trail. Make sure all the truth comes out, not just the parts convenient for powerful men to admit." "The shadow rides again?" Cooper's voice carried understanding, but Sam shook his head slowly. "Not the shadow. Not anymore. That name belongs to a different time, a different kind of justice." He touched Sarah's headstone one last time. "Sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought with guns. Sometimes the most important victories come from exposing the truth, no matter how deep it's buried." Tommy straightened in his saddle. "I could go with you. Help track down the rest of them." "No," Sam's voice was firm but gentle. "Your place is here, helping build something better, same as Martha, same as Hayes and the others. This town needs people who remember what happened here, people who'll make sure it never happens again." The autumn wind picked up, carrying the promise of change. Sam mounted his horse, feeling the weight of the documents in his saddlebag. Somewhere out there, other corrupted men were building their own empires, of shadow and steel. Other innocent people were suffering while the powerful played their games. What should we tell people?" Tommy asked. "When they ask about the man who brought down the Blackwater Gang?" Sam considered this as he adjusted his reins. "Tell them the truth. Tell them about a woman named Sarah who was brave enough to stand up for what was right. Tell them about a town that found its courage when it mattered most." He smiled slightly. "And if they ask about the drunk who turned out to be something more, tell them sometimes the best weapons aren't the ones you can see." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun was climbing toward noon as Sam McCullough rode out of Rattlesnake Creek. Behind him, the town was coming alive with the sounds of honest commerce and free people. The Chinese Quarter's lanterns swayed in the breeze. The school bell rang clear and strong, and everywhere there were signs of renewal, of justice restored. Sarah's grave would always be there, a reminder of what had been lost and what had been gained. But her legacy lived on, in more than just a stone marker. It lived in the truth she'd exposed, in the corruption she'd helped bring down, and in the changes that were spreading across the frontier like ripples in a pond. The man they'd once called Shadow, who'd played the town drunk to expose a conspiracy that reached to the nation's capital, rode toward the horizon. But he wasn't riding toward darkness anymore. He was riding toward light, toward truth, toward the kind of justice that comes not from the barrel of a gun, but from the courage to stand up and say, "Enough." And somewhere in Washington, powerful men were about to learn that their greatest nightmare wasn't the legendary marshal they'd thought they'd broken. It was the truth he carried, the evidence he'd gathered, and the unwavering determination to make sure that truth saw daylight, no matter the cost. The war for Rattlesnake Creek was over, but the battle for justice was just beginning. And Sam McCullough was ready for whatever came next, because some legends don't end. They just change shape, becoming something new, something needed, just like a humble town drunk had become the instrument of justice, and a grieving widower had become the key to exposing corruption that reached to the highest levels of power. The story of the Shadow and Stumbling Sam was over, but the legacy of truth they'd helped expose was just beginning to unfold.